Hello and welcome to Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. I am thrilled to be joined by our guest today, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is currently, I want to make sure that that I get this in before I forget. He's currently running for Congress here in the Valley, and I'll let him give you a little bit of information about that. But I'm going to allow Dr. Jasser to introduce himself because his CV is really quite extensive, and I want to make sure that he's probably getting pretty good at getting the stump speech down and giving us the most relevant parts. So I'm going to let him do that. So Dr. Jasser, would you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you. Yes, yes, I'm running for Congress in the 4th District here, and it's less a pivot and more sort of a culmination of the work that I've been doing, not only in Arizona since being here since '99, but just as being the son of immigrants. My parents escaped Syria in the late '60s. I was blessed to be born in the Midwest, grew up in Wisconsin, and learned that I could practice my faith more freely in a small town in Wisconsin than we could in any Muslim-majority countries. Served in the Navy 11 years as a doc, was on a Navy scholarship through medical school. My tours of duty included USS El Paso to Somalia. We went Operation Restore Hope in 93, 94. And then I was a physician to Congress and the Supreme Court from 97 to 99. Came out here to Arizona, joined my dad in practice, and I've been in private practice, independent practice and primary care, taking care of the community here in Maricopa County and across the state now for over 27 years. And, after 9/11, we formed an organization which brought most of my national work to head, which is to counter radical Islam, to counter the root cause of terrorism, which is simply a symptom. And I, as a Muslim and firstly as an American, felt that our faith community had not gone through a very American process like the founding fathers went through in America, which was fighting against theocracy, advocating for liberty, countering the forces of theocracy that existed in the West to create the greatest democracy in the planet. So post 9/11, I've been trying to educate Americans about the importance of reform within Islam, about countering the ideologies, about us having an offense for liberty against the theocracies, be it Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood or Pakistan's Islamic Republic, etc., and also countering against sort of the identity tribal politics that has fed into a lot of the Islamist movements. And one of the reasons, there's two large reasons I'm running, but one is to flip the script on a lot of the identity politics that exist with the Ilhan Omars and Rashida Tlaibs of the world, where they see our identity in the West more as Muslims who, we've always used the phrase that there are Muslims who happen to be Americans that happen to be Muslim, or Muslims who demand to be American. And obviously, I believe an American that happens to be Muslim, and that salad bowl, if you will, of diversity that exists, we should all be equal before the Constitution. And we get our rights from God, not from government per se. Government protects those rights. So a lot of these battles, I, as not only as a Muslim, but as a physician, have seen the takeover of the American economy by healthcare and been fighting against big healthcare for some time. So it's a natural culmination to take my work in private practice as a naval officer and a veteran, as somebody who's been taking care of the community, to now look towards normalizing representation in Congress, if you will.
I mean, it's truly an astounding career you've had and life you've led. I want to zone in on something that you said. You mentioned that it was easier to practice your faith more freely here in the United States than back in Syria. Are you able to talk about that?
Yeah, and listen, I'm not harboring any delusions that normative Islam, Islam is a faith that's practiced by 1.8 plus billion people, almost 24% of the world's population practices some form of what they may describe as the faith of Islam. Now, those are 56 countries that are Muslim majority, and most of those, if not every one of those countries, is some form of autocracy, kleptocracy, theocracy, but they're certainly not liberal democracies, and as a result, there's no competition within those societies for interpretations of Islam. Many of our families, like my family in Aleppo, Syria, my grandfather from my mom and my dad's side, each had different forms of mechanisms of beginning to look to how the West can inform a modern interpretation of that Islam. So my parents, my dad, who was educated in London but yet had to go back to Syria because the Baathists were a national socialist fascist party that nationalized my grandfather's companies, and the military basically locked down and made Syria since 1963 into an open-air prison. The Syrias of the world were no different than essentially North Korea and many of the fascist societies that prevented any type of free thinking and innovation. So my faith, the way I learned it from my parents in Wisconsin, was a innovative, modern interpretation of the Quran that yes, I could list for you 10, 20 different scholars that I learned from that were modern thinking scholars. Abdul Karim Soroush, which wrote a book on Islam and liberty. Muhammad al-Ashmawi, who spent most of his life in prison under Mubarak and the national so-called Democratic Party in Egypt. So these scholars talked about the separation of mosque and state, the need to bring Islam where Christianity was, where the Bible says, render under Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God's what is God's. That separation had not happened. And essentially the essence of faith being that you need to live in a laboratory of freedom so that if you believe in a judgment day, God will will understand that I have a choice to sin or not sin. So you have to live in a laboratory where I can choose to pray or not pray, drink alcohol or not drink, eat pork or not eat pork, pray or not pray, wear clothes that we might perceive as conservative or liberal. So these are all things that are part of modernity and the defeat of tribalism, where the individual rights take preeminence over the tribe, if you will, which is a very American mindset. So in the end, that form of Islam where it was penultimate liberty based, where I could make a choice to reject God, to reject the Quran or any scriptural interpretations, is something, sadly, you can really only do in the West, which is not Islamic and doesn't have an Islamic flag. But that's ultimately the battle that the Islamic world is under. And that history is so important because you can't have an ahistoric approach to Islam. If you don't understand that Islam is where Christianity was in the 15th and 16th and 17th century, you're not going to be able to contextualize what our strategy should be domestically and globally against Islamist movements.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that before from several people I know who come from Islamic countries and Islamic backgrounds and are devout Muslims that live in the United States, where they actually never felt freer to practice their religion and never felt more comfortable practicing their religion than when they got to the United States. And not just in places that you would imagine, where like large cities with big diaspora populations or anything like that. But one example that comes to mind is an individual whose family lived in Lubbock, Texas, and they never really experienced the joy of being able to practice their religion until they reached Lubbock, Texas, which is not the sort of place you imagine. There's a large Islamic community. I don't know if there's a large Islamic community there, but there probably isn't. So anyway, it's interesting that, just the way that you put that, where, it's only by experiencing the freedoms and the liberties of the West that you can actually truly practice and experience and enjoy your faith.
And Robert, the reality is that with that comes a significant responsibility that Muslims have, because we can do things in the laboratory of America that you can't do elsewhere. And sadly, the self-appointed spokespeople for Muslim organizations and Muslim communities end up looking at Islamic identity as a identity group, as a racial group. They even use the term Islamophobia, which I reject, because yes, I'm not dismissing the concept that there is some bigotry that may exist against Muslims, no different than it exists against any faith group, be it anti-Semitism against Jews or other faith groups or racial identities. But Islam is not a race. It's an ideology. So it doesn't have any rights. It's an idea. So to racialize Islam prevents disagreement, and what it is, it's used, the term Islamophobia is used to create blasphemy laws, anti-blasphemy laws in America, so that Muslims like me get labeled as heretics, and non-Muslims who criticize Sharia ideology within Muslim communities, and we've seen this in Texas and elsewhere, where there's a lot of actually valid criticism. And I've testified in divorce cases where women in Texas, there was a case where a journalist who was a woman couldn't even divorce her husband because the Islamic Society had a contract that said it took preeminence over the American law, over the Constitution, and she didn't have a right to divorce her husband. So that ultimately was dismissed by the Texas Supreme Court, but it took years of legal machinations because they didn't want to, the court system didn't want to interfere in this internal legal system, which was incompatible with American equality and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we have a responsibility as Muslims to speak up for American values, especially those that we want to bring into our faith that are incompatible. And the racial identity folks, whether it's the DEI movements or whatever it might be, are suppressing critical thinking within our faith community. And we as Muslims have to prosecute the case on why the Hassan Pikers of the world, you may know who he is, he's been a radical that has 3 million people on his gaming platform, who says he'd rather be a Hamas devotee than have anything to do with Israel. He's horrifically anti-Semitic. He's radicalizing our youth. And yet, saying anything against them, he labels as being anti-Muslim, Islamophobic, when in fact, he's radical and has a moral inversion of what should be right and wrong in American politics and American discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point on the notion of Islam being race is you know, I when you mentioned it, I was thinking back to, you know, the ISIS era, you know, where ISIS dominated our entire news cycle for about 2 or 3 years. And the amount of people who left the West to join ISIS who had no connection whatsoever to any ethnic Middle Eastern identity or Muslim identity. Many of them did, but it was a lot of, you know, there were Irish, you know, there were Celts and Irishmen and lots of Western European men or Eastern European men who went and joined this, you know, who went and joined this ideology. So it wasn't a race thing whatsoever.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
you know, whether it's ISIS for the Sunni side, Muslim Brotherhood on the Sunni side out of Egypt and globally with hundreds of different metastases, or the Khomeinis on the Shia side, the intoxicant is the same one, which is they believe that somehow government is God, the theocrats should run society and impose and invoke their form of Islam, and everyone else, they divide the world into the land of Islam and the land of war. Everything else is war. That's how they radicalize. And I told Congress in 2011 when Peter King had me testify, and then I said that again to Ted Cruz's committee and DeSantis's committees, I said, it's not just about Muslim radicalization. They're going to come for the far left, and the progressivists are going to see this as sort of a synergistic movement because, and we saw it post-October 7, where horrific crimes against the people of Israel were then normalized and apologized by the far left. And Justice Roberts said it best in just a few weeks ago, where he said, you know, progressivism, he said this University of Texas in Austin, he said progressivism is incompatible with Americanism, not because of its core ideology, but because of its core premise that rights come from government and not from God. And to me as a Muslim, this is so important because I would never die for Islam or for, you know, God, but my government I would defend, and America I would defend because that's what gives me the freedom to practice my faith. So ultimately, Islamists believe the same thing. They think rights come from government. They think that Islam should be the government, and that's what we have to defeat, that ideology, because it creates a moral inversion where individuals don't have rights. Government turns into mobocracy or majoritocracy, which again, Americanism is such a great solution because it's not about, you know, majoritocracy. The word democracy is not in our documents for a reason, because we want to protect the individual rights over the tribe, because that's the only way federalism works. That's the only way you end up protecting the separation of powers and minority rights, because otherwise you end up having mobocracy and no longer individual liberal rights.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just this notion that people who are critics of the Western order, for whatever reason, they're critics. A lot of and become radicalized. Islam becomes an attractive destination for them because in the way that Islam is preached by, unfortunately, so many people, so many clerics, is that it is sort of the key opponent of Western liberal democracy now that global communism has essentially collapsed. And I think of Carlos the Jackal, right? He converted to Islam. Why did he convert to Islam? Because he hates the West, and that's the ideology of hating the West of the moment is Islam. So he converted to Islam because he hates the West, and he's one of many who did the same thing. They were communists when that was the way to hate the West, and they became Islamists when communism, didn't die out, but became less relevant.
And to your point, and this is so important today, in my work outside of my practice of medicine, I helped co-chair now a coalition called the Clarity Coalition, and that stands for Champions for Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny. And one of my mentors was always Senator Kyle, and I got to know, he introduced me to Senator Lieberman, and Senator Lieberman and Kyle in the 20th century chaired the Committee for the Present Danger. And CPD, the Committee for the Present Danger, educated the West and brought together public-private partnership of members of Congress and the Senate, members of corporations, think tanks in Washington, national security apparatus, and said the greatest threat in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. And to their credit, Ronald Reagan then ultimately saw the breakdown of the wall and the defeat of the Soviets without ever having to fire a bullet directly against them. The 21st century, similarly, our coalition is patterned on that, but it's not just anymore just the Marxists, it's the Islamists, and that red-green axis, the Marxist-Islamist axis. And the reason we're getting, they're eating our lunch from China to Russia and the Islamists is because they've had a long-term generational strategy for offense, buying into universities, buying into our media, buying Gulf organizations, buying media, etc., and using bots. We've not had an offense for liberty. And I think it is really, and this is why I so value what you all do at the Center for American Institutions, is Americanism is going to die on the vine if all we care about is domestic marketing. If we say we're only going to market domestically, the people fighting us into the United States are going to destroy our institutions. And that's what they're doing, buying into Georgetown and Cornell and all the billions they're spending. They're getting return on that investment by creating the Hassan Bikers of the future. What is our offense into creating the next Tiananmen Square in China, in Russia, in the Middle East, in Iran? The people's movement in Iran is part of their own organic movement, but I think we should have a larger offense to be unapologetically pro-liberty, which is what I think one of the reasons I'm running is Americanism needs better advocacy from Congress and globally.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more on everything that you just said. I don't often get a chance to say that, but I couldn't agree with you any more than that. Okay, so I want to back up here, and I know you've been involved with countering Islamist narratives in the United States for a long time. A thing you hear about left-wing media, elite media often makes fun of it. But this notion of Sharia law actually existing in the United States, are you able, you mentioned an example earlier, but are you able to actually explain how present it is, what type of a threat actually exists from this?
So I will tell you that the threat is far more so to Muslims than it is to other communities within the United States. And, as a conservative, I've always been concerned about any governmental movement to try to, push back against internal arbitration systems. And, as conservatives, we don't want the government, the only thing worse than, public antiseptic, if you will, would be government interference in private arbitration systems. But having said that, we also have a public responsibility to make sure we're not incubating, systems that promote child abuse, female genital mutilation, that promote the coercion and internal protection from American legal systems that every person should have available to them. And often they don't access because they're either not educated about how to access those protections, those legal protections, or the threats are just so significant. So if you look at honor killings, for example, there are many families in which you will see women that may choose to date, drink alcohol, to dress more, less modestly or whatever it might be, where all of a sudden the conservative Islamist parents decide to either lock them up, torture them, or prevent them from having their own, even as adults, their own rights. So these are part of Sharia is the Arabic term for actually the pathway to the watering hole, which is a euphemism for natural law that human beings use to follow God's law, which is about Islamic jurisprudence. Now, Islamic jurisprudence, if you pick up 99% of the text for Sharia in most mosques in America, still advocate for the killing of apostates who leave the faith, still advocates for the prevention of free speech. All of the things that are still 12th, 13th century thought have not been modernized in Islamic jurisprudence. So we have an obligation, and I think that the states now that are starting to look at outlawing, if you will, Sharia law, I tell them, listen, you can't, it's important to bring a specter and say that we will make sure that no laws violate American law, federal law, and state law. And to that point, not protect and allow the incubation. We've done it in Arizona, where you see polygamous cults that were shut down in northern Arizona and other things where religion does not escape the scrutiny of American federal and state law because it happens to be a religion. And Islam should have no exemption from those protections for the individuals, especially women. If you look, there was a sermon given by a Northern Virginia imam in Falls Church who basically said, oh, female genital mutilation is part of Islamic faith and should be done, and is, on and on, which is just horrific. And there are so many examples. I've worked with the Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation, which has made it illegal in 27 states, and they're working on making it illegal in 50 states. And I can tell you, as a physician, there was a case in Michigan in which they were bringing young girls from Minnesota into Michigan. There was a federal case in which the physicians were indicted and were going to go to prison. And the Supreme Court threw out the case because they did not have, and they dropped the case, the feds dropped the case because Michigan did not have a state law at the time against female genital mutilation. So this is why we need to get our laws up to date in every state across the country, not only against FGM, but against all the things that might be part of Sharia that is sort of being protected from the modernity of Western civilization, especially American law.
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky anytime you're trying to enforce law against groups that are insular, whether, as you mentioned, whether it's a cult or whether it's especially a religious community, because people outside the religious community don't understand the internal dynamics, and it's very easy to throw up a snowstorm or a sandstorm to sort of say, hey, like, you don't understand what's going on here, we do, and making it very difficult to enforce those laws. But I mean, you mentioned the honor killings. I'm Canadian originally, and I remember the Shafia family that was brutally murdered as part of an honor killing back in 2012 in Kingston, Ontario. 3 girls and their mother were drowned because of various cultural violations. So it is real, at least. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit. We've touched on it here, but what are, maybe we can kind of crystallize it a little more clearly, even though I think you've done a pretty good job of it. But what are the challenges for assimilating Islamic immigrants into the United States? I mean, we talk a lot about assimilation, and that there are and some cultural groups do better than others, but I think Muslims tend to be singled out for struggling the most. Is that your experience, or are you able to talk? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is such a topic near and dear to my heart because, first of all, I will tell you, as somebody who, considers myself orthodox in my own interpretations of my faith, granted it's not a prominent conservative movement within the Muslim community globally, but within my own interpretations, I consider myself Orthodox. So, talking to my Jewish friends, I will tell you that the term assimilation, many of us in faith communities are not fans of the term because it typically implies watering down who you are, watering down, your values and things like that are cultural and other things. So, I prefer to talk about um, embracing who we are, not as a melting pot, but as a salad bowl. But what are the core values that our immigrant communities should accept and embrace upon becoming American? And what is that social contract? So it's not about assimilation, but actually embracing the American social contract, which is about, that's why when you become a citizen, the first thing you do is you take an oath. That oath is to protect this country from enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath is about believing in the U.S. Constitution. I took a similar oath as a naval officer. Now, that oath is a little different in that I adhered to the UCMJ, but at the end of the day, it was about the Constitution and that I would protect this country from enemies, foreign and domestic, and that fabric of what is Americanism. And that's why I've called for, and one of the things I'd love to see is as we seal the border and we prevent illegal continued immigration of folks that come here against the law, but rather embrace legal immigration, which there are many different options. We're looking at gold card systems, etc. We need to have a commission on Americanism that revisits what are the things people tell us. In the Cold War, we made them sign that they're not part of the Communist Party and other foreign entities. And it's not just about immigration. When people get security clearances in intelligence services, in the military, government, whatever, in firefighters, police, etc., how do we vet for ideas that are compatible with Americanism versus those that are actually inanimous and working to erode our social cohesion, if you will, that makes us who we are, what it means to be American. And I've spoken about this through Europe. I had a program on citizenship in the Netherlands that we ran in 2008 and 2009 and have gone back to Europe. I did a debate in Oxford a year ago in October 24, and I told them, the Europeans have a bigger problem than we do. America is about immigration. Your countries are based in racial identities of language. Yes, you're liberal democracies, but one of my biggest mentors intellectually was Bassam Tibi. He wrote a book on Islamism. And in that book, at the end, he said, you know what? He was a German professor on German liberal democracy for 40 years, and he yet never felt German. So he retired in Pennsylvania and came to the United States on his retirement at the age of 70. So they have to figure out, and I told the Dutch this, that people in Amsterdam, what does it mean to be Dutch? It can't just be about the language. It has to be about liberal democracy. So I, as an American, when we look at assimilation, it has to be less about, yes, maintain your Arabic identity with music and culture and language and who we are culturally. But at the end of the day, I joined the military because the only thing I die for is America. And that social contract is something, when I talk to Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, and others, we need to figure out don't become an expert in Sharia. Just figure out how our kids and our kids' kids are going to understand what Americanism is and that flag that we have. What does it actually mean when it's flying and what it is that binds us together?
Yeah. I was, in Europe, one of the struggles that I know has been prominent is not necessarily the first generation that arrives in Europe fleeing tyranny. They know what they're escaping. They may not necessarily embrace what they've come to, but they certainly reject what they're escaping. But it's that second generation where they sort of grow up isolated, not part of the culture, and yet not really understanding what they were fleeing either. Is that different in America?
Um, I have to tell you that part of the problem is the perception. You're right. I mean, you know, when you look at families like my parents that escaped, my dad's father's companies were all confiscated by the Syrian Ba'athist Party. They had no property left. He was in and out of house arrest, imprisoned repeatedly, escaped into Lebanon and came to the United States. To him, becoming American wasn't transactional. It wasn't about entitlements and getting, money and being able to survive economically. It was about being free and having property rights and being felt that you could be equal to anyone else in that American dream, if you will. And this is the problem. If you look at the fraud system, I'm running also because healthcare system has been co-opted by so many so-called immigrant populations and used for fraudulent billions we're seeing in Minnesota, California, and elsewhere, where they're exploiting it, and you see it disproportionately being exploited by immigrant populations because it's about transactionality of coming here as if the West owes you something, instead of actually coming to, which most immigrant populations come here because that dream is something they want to produce and work harder than any other community, and are able to have a meritocracy be part of that process. So, it can't be transactional. It has to be ideological. And if you look back, it's not just something about being conservative. The where are the John F. Kennedys that used to say, do not ask not what you can do, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And it has been flipped, and we've lost that center that brings us together about coming together to help our country out, from the left and the right. And now we've been radicalized to where everybody's about conspiracy theories and everything's America's fault, and we're on somebody else's land with somebody else that has to be paid reparations and all these other things, instead of actually lifting ourselves up by our bootstraps and living the American dream.
Yeah. I mean, I don't often get to just nod my head and go, yes, exactly. But I'm doing that right now. Okay, so this is coming from somebody who's not in the obviously not in the Islamic community, so it's an honest question. So it's just intended to be and asked out of ignorance. In Islam, like how my understanding is it's highly decentralized, and it doesn't, in the sense that it really doesn't take much for somebody to claim themselves to be a cleric and become a religious authority. It's not like the Catholic Church, let's say, where there's a laying on of hands. And is that an accurate characterization of what happens, of what it looks like?
So, yes and no. The yes part is for the Sunni tradition. So Muslims are Sunni and Shia, and the major schism that happened in the first, 100 years of the faith with the first four caliphs, and the fourth being, Ali, that created the schism. So if there is any overlay of analogies or metaphors, which is very, very weak, the Shia is more Catholic type, clerical, hierarchical based, versus Sunni, which are very decentralized and more Protestant type. But that's where the analogy ends. There's a lot of differences. We haven't gone through any of the Western Reformations yet. But having said that, that all is that is an analogy that applied early on in Islam, but now in the last 1,000 years, essentially there's no difference between Sunni and Shia, other than a little bit of role of the Khomeinists, as you saw with the clerics in Iran, and we're seeing now with how much there was a merger of government and clerics. But in Saudi Arabia, essentially the Sunni Wahhabi clerics, they're not running government, but they essentially control the judiciary and the educational system. So essentially they are creating one culture with no diversity of thought. And the royal family is tribally running the government and the military. So they came to an agreement in 79 in that Sunni side on the Saudi Arabian side, but similarly in Egypt and elsewhere. But the reason I say your analogy is true in that we're very similar to Judaism, in that imam means teacher, just like rabbi means teacher. So there technically is not supposed to be a hierarchy. The reality, and you're right, imam, there are two schools, major schools. One is Al-Azhar in Cairo, and the other is in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, the main schools of Wahhabi leadership and most of the clerical thought globally. Now, if you look at the bandwidth of Islamic eschatology, if you will, not only eschatology, but epistemology of knowledge and the body corpus of Islam, 99.9% either comes from Saudi Arabia or Egypt, Cairo, Al-Azhar. That's it. They have soaked up the bandwidth and essentially created a pseudo-clergy because of petro-Islam. So petro-Islam has taken trillions and dumped into the bandwidth of what is spent on Islam. This is why I, as a physician, and many of us who don't make, anyone who's making money from Islam in the 20th and 21st century is the problem, period. Anyone who has an income where they get a paycheck that says Islamic whatever, and they're writing them, 99.9% of them are bought and paid for by Islamist movements, and it is a problem. The future for reform, just like it did in the West, reform in Europe did not come from the church community, the leadership clergy. It came from the business community and those who rejected them running government, which is why the first step for reform, I might not be an expert, in Sharia, but if you look at the debate I had against the imam out of the Tempe Mosque, you can look at it, it's still online. I spent most of the time for the 2 hours of our debate telling him what was wrong with the theology, and he spent an hour and a half saying I wasn't qualified and I didn't have degrees in Sharia, and that's all he said. He didn't address any of the ideas that I was saying, while I addressed the ideas, and he has since refused to ever debate again, as have many of the imams that we've debated. They will melt away because they know that if we had a toe-to-toe debate on issues, they will lose, and every time 90% of the audience of Muslims at those debates comes back and says, boy, Zuhdi, I thought you were anti-Muslim and some devil, and now I listened to you actually, and you're very pro-Muslim and pro-American and just anti-Islamist. So this is the problem, is that the trillions where the Saudis are either spending it on, and the Iranians, the clerics and others are either spending it on their theological, theocratic ideas, or they're spending it on empty cities in a desert, and never on schools of humanities, schools of liberal arts, of journalism, of philosophy. All they open in the Middle East are STEM schools, which is fine, but STEM is not going to modernize a culture. It'll modernize science, but look, they're not modernizing political science or social sciences.
Yeah. No kidding. So what can ordinary people like myself in the West who are not a part of the Islamic community, though I have many, Islamic, Muslim friends and acquaintances, connections who are, what can we do?
So I think first of all is, I can't tell you how important it is to flip the script to if you believe in, whether you're conservative or liberal and you believe in diversity has to mean that we have to have a diversity of ideas at the table of American discourse. And in politics, for example, right now the Muslim discourse is all about one side, which is the racialized identity politics side, and we're not hearing the other side of those who challenge authority and speak truth to power within, not only domestically, but within the global Muslim community. So begin to look at ambassadors or folks that can prosecute the case for American ideas, and people like myself who they can't call me an Islamophobe or anti-Muslim, which is why they avoid me. So number one, not only obviously selfishly to help my campaign, but to help, also get diverse voices out there, because we can immediately counter the Ilhan Omar's, Rashida Tlaib's, the AOCs and others that are using identity politics to rip apart our country, number one. Number two, begin to, within your own communities, start to put an end to the bigotry of low expectations. Interfaith discussion should not be just about what we share and we share in common, but talk to your Muslim friends and neighbors and other faiths about what it is that makes us different, and how do we then take those differences. Are they saying the same thing in their kitchen tables that they are in public? And if they're not saying the same thing and there's a disconnect between their values at home or in the mosque and then in interfaith discussions, then that's a problem. That's a lack of transparency and a dishonesty. So begin to have some debate and healthy discussions of what the American diverse communities look like. And third, I think it's important to have an offense of what Americanism is. Whatever civic organization you're involved in, be it your city councils, boards of education, be it your Kiwanis clubs or Rotary groups, women's groups, whatever it might be, begin to talk about Americanism and how we, not just about Muslims, progressivists, Marxists, far right. We're seeing wokeism on the far right now, where anti-Semitism. I've talked to people in my close friends in the Jewish community that are having a hard time finding places that will allow them to talk about why Israel's place in history is so unique and why it's a little America in the Middle East. And that anti-Semitism is going to eat us alive as a country unless we start to have discussions of what Americanism is about, why our ally truly is Israel in the Middle East, and all of these other discussions follow from it.
Yeah. So, assuming you're elected in November and you're in Congress, what are you going to do?
So, that's a great question. I think my first goal legislatively will be to begin to bring back free market incentives to healthcare. That's really one of my top priorities, because the unaffordability of healthcare is just eating up the American economy. It's over a quarter of the world's economy. And if you look at the far left movement, it will tell you over history that if they can control 15% or more of the economy, they will then be able to then take over everything else. And that's what healthcare is all. That's what the healthcare takeover has been all about, the vertical consolidation, et cetera, to begin to look at the nonprofit status of hospitals and other lack of transparency, et cetera. That's number one. Two is to root out fraud and abuse, not only in the healthcare system, but in government, and begin to be part of the movement to make sure that members of Congress are not enriching themselves while they are going to supposedly representing the people and being a voice. And third is to become a voice. The current member of Congress that's there, Mr. Stanton, has done very little to talk about the things that he should be leading. Members of Congress should be leading our society, our community, on ideas, and at least take a position to talk about things like anti-Semitism, free market healthcare, the economy, and other things, but instead of just, sort of being a placeholder and a filler. So that's what I seek to do. And most importantly, I mentioned earlier, I believe the president and our executive branch should form a commission on Americanism, bipartisan commission that looks at how to keep our country, our two-party system. As much as I love diversity, I think one of the things that's kept us towards the center is the two-party system. If you look at countries like France, Israel, and others that are constantly at being at odds ends, they have 5, 6 different political parties. I believe in the two-party system, but we have to make sure it's not a polar opposite. It's actually more closer to the center of what are the things that are the 80-20 issues, which I think a commission on Americanism would help bring back.
Yeah, I like that, all of that, but I really like that notion of the 80-20 issue, and that there are a remarkable amount of 80-20 issues that actually, are agreed upon on a bipartisan basis. And if we don't recognize that, then the 10% of that on either side will pull us apart, and much too dangerously.
Exactly, and there's so many, every issue. You hear the term gaslighting talked frequently, and the 20% exists on every issue. There's always a 10-20%, and there's a minority voice we need to hear, we need to know. But if that voice gets inordinately loud and inordinate attention, then it becomes gaslighting. And this is also what happens with things like, you may call it Trump derangement syndrome. I also, on the Iranian issue, it's Iran derangement syndrome, where we were focused on the JCPOA and other things while we kept kicking the can down the road for essentially 2 generations, 1 generation since 9/11, but 2 generations since 79. And we allowed, basically facilitated the nuclear armamentation of a fratricidal regime which sees mutually assured destruction as a goal, not as an obstacle, but as a goal. That type of gaslighting, to where we just sort of said, oh, no, they're not going to, if you disagree with that, then you're all pro-war. No, it's not pro-war to be, that's gaslighting me. I'm actually believing in what we're doing now in Tehran against the Islamists, because we want to end this forever 47-year war. So we just have to listen to the 80% and not nullify their voices by gaslighting a minor minority position.
Yeah, no kidding. So how can people get involved in your campaign?
So please go to Z4AZ, Z4AZ.com, and follow me on Twitter at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DrZuhdi or at Dr. Z4AZ.
And the 4th District, can you tell people what communities that involves?
Yeah, so that's all of Tempe, most of Mesa, a little bit of Chandler, Northwest Chandler, and Ahwatukee, Phoenix, and a little bit of South Scottsdale. So it was redistricted in 21. It went from being a very heavy Democrat district at D+8 to now just what we consider a swing district at D+2%.
Sounds good. Well, I wanted to get that in because I have one last question, and it's a finishing question, but I figured we might you might have a lot to say, so I am gonna try to be fair, but I'd feel bad not asking it. So we've seen a major revolution in Syria, in your parents' homeland, in the last couple of years. What's your perspective on what's happened, and maybe the opportunity for the for Syrians' future?
Such a great question. And in 2011, I was so hopeful. The revolution started then, and my grandfather and my father had just sort of dumped their Syrian national identity, because they said, and my grandfather, who was a politician, a businessman, and was very influential in the late 40s and early 50s when Syria had its attempt with democracy, essentially threw his hands up and left Syria and said in 63 and said every people deserve the government they have, and basically left. I wish he was alive in 2011 to see the price the Syrians paid. 800,000 dead till 25, and 10 million displaced out of a population of 21 million. Over half the population displaced either internally or externally, with the slaughtering over and over, caught between not only the Assad military apparatus, but the ISIS militarization, etc. And I testified to Congress about what our policy should have been in 2011, and unfortunately, the Obama administration, in bed also with Qatar and Turkey, basically empowered the Islamists and fed into the Brotherhood and the jihadists, and basically made them, sort of the lesser of evils compared to ISIS, etc. And now, I will tell you frankly, you look at Tom Barak, ambassador to Turkey, he gave a speech I'd ask people to go back and look at. He talked for 30 minutes just 10 days ago, and basically said, the Middle East, we need to stop the fueling of revolutions, because it makes a lot more peace and sense to have stability. I'm watching that, saying, this is an American saying? I couldn't believe an American was saying this, but basically he's giving the talking points of Qatar and Turkey, which are, Turkey's run by an Islamist movement. Qatar is run by, a caliphate-seeking Islamist royal family that is, trying to consolidate power with the Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera, etc. So bottom line is I see Syria going through the same evolution that Iran went through. Now, hopefully it won't take 47 years for Syria to get rid of, Iran shed its monarchy in 79 and said, we're done with that, enough of the Game of Thrones, which Barak type were saying that, we need to go back to the Game of Thrones of the 20th century. No, stop picking winners and losers in the Middle East. Let it happen organically. So organically in Syria, let's work on fueling civil society movements to help liberalism. Shara'a, who was an ISIS advocate, who was an Islamist, who was on our most wanted list for years, is no moderate, but is pretending to be so. So as he pretends to be so, he's going to build some civil institutions that I hope will modernize Syria. And I hope in shorter than 49 years, like in Iran, we'll see revolution 2.0, 3.0, then push away the jihadism. I think Syria, as I testified to Congress in 13 and in 16, Syria has a lot more future for a liberal democracy because it's so diverse. 60% Sunni, 10% Christian, 10% Druze, Kurds minority, and so many other diverse little groups. So it has a future if it comes together and doesn't fragment like a Bosnia Herzegovina. If it stays as one community and one state, it will become hopefully a more liberal democracy in the middle of a neighborhood that then Iran will be modernized, I hope, and hopefully we'll see a 21st century that'll be a whole new millennium for the Middle East.
Well, here's hoping. Dr. Jasser, thank you very much. Best of luck on your campaign, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for all you do. Appreciate it, Robert.
Thank you very much.